Morning, everybody, and welcome to this discussion of cybersecurity threats and information sharing here at the Center for New American Security. I'm Richard Fontaine, CEO of CNAS, and very pleased to join the audience and our speakers today to talk about information sharing, especially between the public and private sector when it comes to national security threats related to cyberspace and cyber issues. Some of the recent attacks on critical infrastructure, Colonial Pipeline, SolarWinds, and others have really highlighted the urgency to address the national security threats of cyber-based attacks. This has made news across the country and across the world and has been a key element of work for the U.S. government and those in the private sector trying to deal with these kinds of threats as they come in. Part of the answer to this, of course, is to improve information sharing between the public and the private sector, but how to do that is still a matter of discussion and something that we want to get into today. So we're really pleased to have here to discuss this with us, Deputy Assistant Secretary to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technology, Anne Neuberger. She's been with us before, and we're glad to have her back. And joining her in conversation is Daniel Silverberg. He's Adjunct Senior Fellow at CNAS and was formerly National Security Advisor to the House Majority Leader. Without further ado, let's turn it over to Daniel and to Anne to kick off the discussion. And thank you both for being here.
Terrific. Richard, thank you so much. And I'm so honored to be here at CNAS and be here with you, Anne, both as a friend and a work colleague. I've really marveled at the work that you've done in the administration so far. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. It is wonderful to be here. Thank you for the introduction as well.
Terrific. I thought it'd be useful to start off with that question that Richard hit on. The White House issued, and I think the President spoke about it, a pretty chilling warning that Russia was intending to attack U.S. critical infrastructure. And I'm curious, one, what kind of response did you get? And two, what were the lessons learned that you took from that? And three, where do we go from here in terms of public-private sharing and specifically protecting critical infrastructure?
It's a really great question, Daniel. And first I'll note that what occurred in March when we saw the heightened threat stream and intelligence collection, briefed it to the President, and he immediately said, we need to share this with the American public and really put a focus and make them aware that we need to double down on security. So it highlights how much domestic cybersecurity is so closely tied to foreign policy. Mm-hmm. The threat stream was in the context of Russia's further brutal invasion of Ukraine, and a sense that as the United States would impose, with allies and partners, sanctions to impose costs, the Russians could respond with cyber attacks domestically. And that core thinking of that tie between foreign policy and domestic is, I think, the biggest change in how we think about cyber, and something that the President is particularly focused on. So your point is what happened then and what we learned. So first, what happened then? We saw an upswing of focus across the private sector. We'd kicked off that work the prior November with CISA, the Department of Energy, the Department of Treasury, agencies going to their sectors, providing threat briefings as part of getting private sector action to do the kinds of steps that are necessary to lock their digital doors and ensure that we were prepared for what might come. So certainly we saw the private sector really take that more seriously, start to focus on it, and I think respond to the heightened threat intelligence sharing and the call for specific steps. The second part of that was we really deepened our international cooperation, because in line with implementing sanctions with so many of our partners in Europe and Asia, we knew they faced risks as well. And it built on efforts that we'd started, like the International Counter-Ransomware Initiative, bringing countries together, but that heightened both intelligence sharing globally as well as sharing of cybersecurity practices, really deepen those international partnerships.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'd actually love for you to speak more about those international partnerships. You just came back from the president's trip in Saudi Arabia. Your head was, I think, third in line next to the president, a little bit further back in the New York Times picture. But I was thrilled to see that you were there because it was indicative of the commitment to both cyber partnerships, that international component, and that there are any number of areas where we can enhance cooperation with a partner like Saudi. Can you give us your sense of the trip? How partners like Saudi Arabia, with whom we obviously have a somewhat complex relationship, how can they help us on the type of cybersecurity initiatives that you're advancing? And can you tell us about the 5G partnership that you struck there?
Absolutely. So clearly, these cyber and tech issues were part of the broader goals that the president was seeking to accomplish as part of the visit to the region, building on the integration and other work. But further to our earlier point, when we think about threats in the region and what some of the countries are really concerned about, one key area of concern is Iranian cyber attacks. We've certainly seen in the US an increase in Iranian ransomware activity. The director of FBI has talked about that. And when countries in the region come to us, they talk about concerns of Iranian attacks against energy infrastructure, both on the information technology side and potentially disrupting energy production. So they really are interested in deepening cooperation, and as part of the trip, both DHS and FBI had signed memorandums of understanding to do that deeper partnership on cyber information sharing. Mm-hmm. The 5G agreement and memorandum that we signed really related to both a strategic and a practical technical goal. From a strategic perspective, we're very concerned about Chinese presence in telecommunication networks. Due to the complexity of telecommunication networks, it's very hard to secure a network if you don't have confidence in the core gear. And that's one of the reasons why it's been such a strategic initiative for the United States in 5G and future 6G to press for trusted providers and to ensure that, particularly in countries around the world, we can work with those countries to press for using trusted providers. Mm-hmm. Huawei has a major presence in the Middle East, and Western providers have had trouble competing economically with the heavily Chinese government subsidized Huawei technology. That's one of the reasons we find Open RAN so interesting. It builds on both cloud and software approaches where the US and other countries, Western countries, have a key lead, where the costs can compete. And as a result, signing an agreement to partner on research and technology to pilot 5G initiatives in Saudi was such a priority. It shows that we can compete with Chinese initiatives. The Saudis are putting real progress there, and American companies and Western companies are eager to highlight that software, virtualized Open RAN approaches can deliver on a whole host of really cool technology approaches.
What does success look like then?
Success?
If this experiment works with Saudi, where do we go from here? What does success look like?
Really cool question. I'd say three things. First, success is a pilot Open RAN approach. Open RAN are just the pipes. So tied to some initiative, whether it's in smart grid, energy initiative, where we pull the data back on grid operations to find a threat, whether it's a cyber threat, or to find an opportunity. Like there are points in the grid that are consuming more energy. How can that be done more efficiently? So it's it's first, as I noted, deploying 5G and Open RAN and showing it can compete in a secure and scalable way, and then also tying it to some outcome initiatives. Second, it is really our first partnership for global infrastructure effort, where we're working to build secure infrastructure around the world. Clearly, the Saudis are a key player in the region, so when they build the cloud and software approaches, scaling that to some countries in Africa, more broadly in the Middle East, to really compete with the Huawei implementations there and highlight that this technology can do so from a security and cost perspective is our goal.
Terrific. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention a housekeeping point that our audience are welcome to offer questions through the chat function. In the meantime, I'd love to continue on this. It's funny, we're talking about Saudi, and yet the thrust of this event, and what I presume is how you spend most of your day is on US challenges with information sharing. So I'd love to hear more on the Saudi front of how you think about the criticisms that have been advanced against the president, that he shouldn't have gone to Saudi in the first place, because you are talking about a very concrete deliverable from the trip. So in terms of weighing those cost benefits on Saudi writ large, how do you think about it? And then two, bringing us back home, you are functioning in effect as a key cyber diplomat, epitomized by what just happened in Saudi Arabia, your trip to India last year. Seems like there's a lot of diplomacy that you undertake here in the States with companies. And I would welcome hearing about, what does that look like? Tell us the executives that you're meeting with. What do the conversations look like? And frankly, is there a certain point where you just want to sit everyone down and say, enough diplomacy, enough playing nice, this is our country. This isn't interacting in the Gulf. These are our networks. We can't compel you to act, but you have to do better. What does this look like?
So a lot of questions nested
Sorry,
in there, but really appreciate that. So I'll highlight a few key things. One is, on the international front, it's like, I think it was the old Babe Ruth line, show up, right? What we're asking for, there's often sensitive components to cyber. There's sensitive intelligence, which we may be sharing about third countries compromising some of our allies and partners. And the key reason that we do it from a White House perspective is what we're seeing is, to really be effective in cyber requires integrating intelligence, law enforcement, domestic agencies like CISA from a resilience perspective, and then particularly as we look at issues like ransomware, which are affecting countries all around the world, things like Treasury's role in disrupting illicit use of crypto. So when we show up as a White House, we're highlighting how in the US system, we're working to drive integration across all those components, and that because the president places a priority on this issue, both for the domestic resilience aspect as well as for the impact on foreign policy. And that we're asking our counterpart countries, in some cases bilaterally, if there are sensitive compromises or particular efforts that we want them to work on with us, or multilaterally, to apply the same focus at their White House equivalent level so that they can merge across the individual silos of resilience, law enforcement, intelligence, to be effective in the space at the speed and with the relevance needed. So, I'm going to highlight the Quad initiative as a great example, right? 4 key countries in there. India is one. We used that effort to say, let's align on cybersecurity standards so that we're speaking to our technology sectors with one voice about how they need to build security in different ways. Let's use the power of our government purchases of tech to then show we're serious. And then finally, let's ensure that in our critical infrastructure, particularly telecom, we're really crystal clear on what a trusted provider looks like. So in the Quad, when we get 4 countries to say that together, and we get the head of state communique to reference that, showing that those 4 major leaders really are behind the importance and are driving the importance, we can achieve so much more. And I think to your point, from a domestic perspective, we're working to shift the narrative from incident response, which is cleanup in aisle 9. It's important, but it's not making us more secure, in a fundamental way, to setting cybersecurity standards for the key elements of critical infrastructure, to say, if you're operating an oil and gas pipeline, here's the minimums you have to have in place to lock your digital door, to put on your digital alarm system. And to that, I would highlight the work that the Transportation Safety Administration, TSA, did following Colonial Pipeline, where for the first time, the Secretary of DHS exercised his emergency authorities and set requirements, first for pipelines and then later for aviation and for rail, to say, we're serious. You need to have these minimums in place so that we have a sense of confidence that our infrastructure is more secure and will continue to be more secure as threats evolve.
How much time do you spend day to day, on an average day, on the international piece versus the domestic piece that you just described?
That's a great question. It varies from day to day based on, for example, after Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, we were thinking hard, both about domestic cyber resilience and being able to provide options if there was a cyber attack against critical infrastructure. So I would say overall, on average, it's half and half. But at any given moment in time, based on what's happening on the international front, that could shift.
I'm going to come back in a moment to the domestic side, and I'd love to hear more about the conversations that you're having with CEOs and the domestic diplomacy that you're doing. I first want to take a question from the audience. From Hongju, on a cyber threat, there's a perception that Russia and China are at the top, and the DPRK. And then, of course, Iran has significant capabilities. However, these days we've heard more and more often about North Korea than any of these other countries. What's your level of concern about North Korea, and how would you rank those countries in terms of threats right now?
I'm very concerned about North Korea's cyber capabilities for 3 reasons. One, they use cyber to gain, we estimate, up to 1/3 of their funds to fund their missile program. That's a major issue, whether it's attacks against cryptocurrency exchanges or use of information technology workers in various countries. Clearly, the continued advancements, the number of launches in the North Korean missile program is a priority for us. So given that cyber is such a core driver of revenue, it's something we must address. We've done a number of innovative things this year, like designating a cryptocurrency exchange, doing work against the dark market, as we call it, of activity. We're doubling down and planning to do much more work to make it riskier, costlier, and harder for North Korea to gain funds that way. They're also of concern because they're one of the countries who have conducted destructive attacks in cyber, and because they are continuously innovating. They're at the cutting edge of how do you use technology and cyber to glean funds or to cause harm. So they are high on our list. All 4 of those countries are high on our list for different reasons, because they each use cyber attacks, whether for espionage or for destructive purposes, to achieve their national objectives. So I won't rank order them, because we are concerned about each and have very focused strategies to address each, as well as, frankly, criminals who are causing great harm via disrupting infrastructure via ransomware attacks.
How well prepared do you think we are on the Russia threat to critical infrastructure 4 months after the March warning?
It's a great question. We're far better prepared than we were at the beginning of the administration because of really the president's relentless focus on improving the resilience of critical infrastructure from a cyber perspective. And the work, as I mentioned, agencies like TSA has done, CISA, the Department of Energy has done, to really press for action, press for improved security among the private sector. But we have far more to do across key sectors, given both the ongoing innovation. You know, an offensive actor only has to be good once. When you're operating defensively, you have lots of doors and windows you've got to make sure you secure. So there's far more we need to do, and that partnership with the private sector, the really relentless focus driven from the White House across agencies, is key.
Well, I want to highlight a question from one of our audience members on, given the nature of these threats and the partnership that we're forging with Saudi Arabia, how strong is the discussion with the EU right now on combating Russian cyber threats, on pursuing the kinds of initiatives that we were talking about with Saudi in terms of securing ICT and the 5G supply chain, and what other initiatives might be planned among industry, academia, the European Commission to strengthen our networks?
Really, really good question. 3 core points. First, the EU is a major partner. Part of that is in the TTC, but really in driving
the TTC,
the Trade and Technology Council. Thank you that brings together the U.S. and the EU to set a common approach in both trade and tech issues. So, key partner on that with regard to setting standards for cybersecurity, with regard to looking at areas like post-quantum cryptography. So we roll those out in integrated ways. as well as looking at areas like digital assets and how do we ensure that those are secure. So we talked to the EU both about current cybersecurity as well as improving cybersecurity or baking cybersecurity into any number of emerging technology issues. Really core partner in that way, as well as talking to individual European countries about that. So as Sweden and Finland were talking about their accession to NATO, right? They were concerned about potential Russian cyber attacks. We clearly had bilateral conversations. They're really capable countries. But to ensure that we were sharing intelligence rapidly, to ensure that we exchanged best practices against protecting against particular Russian techniques. The Department of Energy has done really great work putting out products focusing on Russian techniques against energy, which of course is a core priority right now and a core focus, flagging those products, and then learning from each other as well.
The international piece is so critical, and it's helpful to hear everything you're doing. I really want to bring it back to the US, and I apologize for firing a barrage of questions at you. I just get enthusiastic about really understanding the progress that you and the core team of cyber experts are trying to make in getting US companies to do what everyone knows they need to be doing on protecting our networks. I'd like to ask you just the emotional piece of, I worked on CISPA in 2015 on the Hill, and it seemed like such a no-brainer.
Lots of people are emotional about that.
Well, that's CISPA was a, for the audience, CISPA was legislation that it wasn't even going to compel public-private info sharing. It was to establish a framework so that when cloud companies, cyber companies, anyone, critical infrastructure companies, identified a potential risk, that they can share it in a legally protected fashion with the government. And it just struck us as so common sense, and yet was so challenging to do, and we never got it done. It was frustrating. The fact that it remains an issue is emotionally disappointing, and also from a national security perspective, deeply problematic. So I just want to ask you, you deal with this every day. You talk to companies, you preach the gospel in essence on you need to get better with your cyber hygiene. I hate to sound Californian and say, how do you feel about it? But what's your level of either frustration or contentment with, is your message getting across? Where do you feel like you're actually hitting pay dirt on your efforts to ensure that US companies are doing better?
Colonial Pipeline was a major milestone in US domestic cybersecurity because it represented status quo. It represented where we were with regard to having a major oil and gas pipeline serving the entire East Coast with no requirements on what their cybersecurity needed to be, no requirements that if a major incident happened, it had to be rapidly reported, and reflecting the significant rise in ransomware in the country and the work we needed to do to bring together the intelligence community, Treasury, CISA, FBI, to really each bring their tools to an integrated, more effective, coherent approach against ransomware, used by criminal actors in that case, but provided harbor, safe harbor by a country, Russia. So it really represented the full spectrum of what we face in cyber. And three things coming out of that, to your point, answer the question, but also highlight how much progress the administration has focused on making, really, and how much the president has pressed for ongoing progress. First, after that I mentioned the DHS secretary exercised his emergency authorities and levied minimum cybersecurity requirements for oil and gas pipelines. So based upon that, first we identified who are the critical pipelines in the country. There are 96. They now have requirements. As of this past January, we've seen the results of putting in place minimum practices, having an incident response plan, reporting incidents to the government. At the time, we moved out very quickly. We got feedback from the private sector. TSA rapidly adjusted and issued new guidelines just earlier this month. We brought in oil and gas executives in 3 groups, because there were that many, to give them classified threat briefings, because we realized that we couldn't expect them to have the same sense of urgency if they weren't seeing the same set of information. And since then, we've used that same set of practices. So next week we'll be hosting the set of railroad CEOs, I believe it's 9, and the Association of Railroads, to give them a classified briefing of how we see China or Russia potentially disrupting railroads in the country, perhaps as part of disrupting troop movements, as you know, right? The military uses the same commercial rail, or potentially as part of transporting hazardous materials and causing an incident. We share that context with them, and then we make clear that the new directive outlining requirements is because of that. So that first major change, where we shifted from saying it's all about incident response to saying incident response matters, but also having those minimums. If you don't lock your door, you're probably going to be the home on the block that's robbed. The second aspect is the progress that the Hill has made on putting in place incident reporting legislation. I mentioned to you that's only half of the solution. We need the other half, which is a consistent set of mandated cybersecurity practices supporting sector risk management agencies and their authorities. That's a second area we need as well, which we're engaging on the Hill. But the progress the Hill made on an incident reporting bill, so we get reported incidents and we can learn from them and rapidly provide guidance to other companies and government agencies so that the same techniques can't be used again and again, is super important. And then finally, I would highlight the work the private sector has done on improving the security of tech. You may have seen just about 4 or 5 months ago, the White House hosted a virtual event on open source following the Log4j incident, where we said this highlights that open source software is used both government and across the private sector, but nobody's taken ownership at the level needed to improve that security. Coming out of that, there were a set of very specific initiatives on improving the security of open source, making it easier to use tools to see what components are in the tech that we use. And a number of companies, as well as the Open SSF Foundation, really stepped up, took leadership, and have been driving really significant efforts to improve the technology, the security of technology. So I think those 3 areas, putting in place mandates, the Hill stepping up as a key partner, and the private sector stepping up as a key partner, have been major changes over the last 18 months.
It's not going to surprise you.
There's much more to be done.
I'm sure. I'm sure that it won't surprise you that as a former Hill staffer, I'm gravitating towards that point number 2. It's funny that when you mentioned FBI, Treasury, intelligence community, how multi-jurisdictional this challenge is, I immediately went to thinking about the congressional dynamics. And going back to CISPA, one of the challenges we had is public-private cyber info sharing legislation crosses multiple committees and jurisdictions. And in one like that provides a more fertile debate, you have HISCAC and CISI and E&C and a number of committees participating at the same time. Inevitably, that creates a kind of bureaucratic legislative homeostasis and challenge. What do you think is in the realm of the possible? If you had a fantasy wand, what would you want Congress to do? I heard you say Congress has done a great job with part of the picture. There's still a lot more to do. If you were ruler for a day, how do you navigate that the jurisdictional challenges, and what would you want Congress to do?
So I'll flip the order with regard to the what and then the how. We are behind other countries in setting cybersecurity requirements for the critical elements of infrastructure. The most significant: water, power, pipelines, hospitals in the country, as well as the technology that crosses all of them. And I'll point to legislation that Australia recently passed, the result of 2 years of extensive consultation with the private sector, with advocates, with academia, to put in place those requirements as where we need to go. Because while we need to be able to respond to incidents quickly and know about incidents that happen, Much as when we drive a car, the car comes with a seatbelt, it comes with airbags, it comes with standards for what's the speed you can drive on the road and what happens if there's a major accident. We need the same for cyber. We did elements that we could across the President's executive order. For example, the President stood up a cyber safety review board modeled on the NTSB. It just issued its first report with a kudos and a shout out to Rob Silvers at the Department of Homeland Security, who chaired that with a private sector partner as well.
That's not mandatory standards.
No, sorry, that's a review board after an incident, so we learn lessons from it. So I'm highlighting that portion of it we were able to do via executive order, but we really need the Hill to put in place those mandatory standards and to make them, one size won't fit all. Each sector has to look different because each sector reflects the regulatory model in that sector, the existing authorities that sector risk management agencies have in that sector. But what we need is a minimum set of mandates that, for example, I'll look at hospitals, right? We have CMS at hospitals. They mandate the security and safety of hospitals. We have HIPAA rules. We need to have that for cybersecurity, and we need to ensure HHS has the authorities to do so. Water systems, EPA. Similarly, there are roughly, I believe it is 1,100 critical water facilities across the country. And EPA does sanitary reviews of those water systems. They'll be shortly issuing a rule to extend those to include cybersecurity as well. But we need the Hill to ensure that those authorities are clear so that as threats continue to evolve, and water systems are a great example, right? Many of those remain manual. As they're modernized, to ensure, as sensors are added, to ensure cybersecurity is baked in, so there's the funding for that. There's the people at EPA who have the basis of knowledge, who can look at a sector and ensure the cybersecurity of that sector is holistically considered. And then, of course, to have the authorities to mandate it. Because one of the things we've learned is that public-private partnerships are effective. And I mentioned the President launched one early in his administration focused on industrial control systems. They're never going to give us the same level of standards or the same level of confidence as we have when there's a mandate. We could, I'll use airbags as an example. Until it was a requirement to wear a seatbelt, as much as there were any number of people who understood it and did it, there wasn't the confidence. We didn't have a confidence as a country that every car you bought came that way.
Is there a moment when the White House might think about pursuing some kind of broader mandate to compel action? With God's help, Congress will act, and I'm one of those optimists, having worked there for 14 years. I actually think Congress will act, but as we just talked about, this does not hit one jurisdiction. This is not just a HISCAC issue or an Intel issue. It hits so many jurisdictions. So it's still going to take a while. Is there a moment when you would recommend to the President, this threat is moving too quickly. We can't wait for Congress to act. We need some kind of executive directive to mandate standards in order to have that level of confidence that you described?
It's a great question. So first, now is the moment to improve the security of critical infrastructure, and I mentioned how much progress has been done. Following Colonial, we did a review of all existing authorities, and the authority we found that we could use was government purchases of technology. And the President, in his executive order, laid that out, as well as leveraging existing authorities agencies might have. I mentioned the emergency authorities. I mentioned EPA's existing security and safety, to extend those to include cyber. So those are efforts underway. However, where the Hill is a major partner is on looking at those sectors which lack authorities or where there's hesitancy by agencies to move without real Hill backing to do so. And we've started engagement on the Hill, and I've gotten a lot of interest and excellent feedback and discussion on what the right path is to do that. So we're really looking forward to, over the next few months, continuing that engagement, hearing the input of members of the Hill and staffers as well, and crafting that together.
Terrific. Let me shift to an audience question for a moment. Martin wants to know your perspective on the evolving cyber threat landscape where hacking as a service proxies are increasingly doing the work for state actors like Russia. And what can allies do to effectively counter that?
Martin, it's a really good question because it's an area of key concern. It used to take real skill to hack and have an impact, but when there, as you noted, hacking as a service, and we've seen that shift in ransomware criminal activity, it just extends the number of people who can do harm by doing so. So where allies can be most helpful is really in 5 ways, and they're represented in the 5 lines of work we have in our International Counter-Ransomware Initiative. First, referencing common ways to disrupt the infrastructure that's used and the hackers, whether it's arrests or other factors that's by those groups, to make it far harder and costlier for them to operate. Second is exposing some of the tools and techniques that they do, so that cybersecurity firms pick those up and build protections against them in the products that we all use. Third is diplomacy, engaging countries where those hackers as a service or hacking as a service entities operate to press them to take ownership and act against these actors. Fourth, working far more closely with the private sector. You've seen some of the disruption operations, for example, that individual companies have done in partnership with the Department of Justice. And then finally, countering illicit use of crypto, which is a core driver of some of this work, because it makes it so easy to move money or to glean funds. And that's where Treasury's work on getting countries to implement anti-money laundering initiatives, designating those exchanges that primarily are used by hackers to conduct their operations, looking at things like mixers that mix a bunch of different transactions together to make it easier to launder money, to see what's appropriate for us to do in that space is key. And of course, all of that we have to do with international partners because the infrastructure is all around the world, the hackers are all around the world, so only in partnership with other countries around the world can we be effective.
I think you mentioning hackers, international partners, and domestic threats got a lot of interest in the audience about your discussions with South Korea. And going back to the conversation we were having on North Korea, I think that there's interest from Sion with the VOA, Jason. I think people are interested in the status of the Joint Cyber Working Group and what we are doing to protect allies like Korea from both Chinese threat and the North Korean hacking threat.
So that's a great question. I just got back from South Korea, new administration, when President Biden recently met incoming new president, President Yoon. In the communique, they talked about cyber. President Yoon had mentioned that as a key priority area. He's announced initiatives to grow the cyber workforce in South Korea. Those issues exist all around the world. It all boils down to great people, and everybody wants to build more people with those skills. But the goals there were really 2 parts. South Korea has a capable technology base. This is an area they're focused on. So we talked about how we work together to make it harder for DPRK, North Korea, to gain funds to support their missile program via cyber. We also talked about how to better protect against various nation-state actors and highlighted some of the current areas where we can partner and improve our partnership together, particularly with a focus on government and critical infrastructure networks. And we also talked about South Korea's leadership in the Indo-Pacific region, given its technology base, and the companies, the major technology companies, both baking in security, as well as building more secure supply chains in the region as well. So a lot of good work to be done. And I would say that that's a great example of partnership versus one-handed helping, because in all of these initiatives, we seek to really bring what each country brings uniquely. And when we work together, everybody brings something different towards a much more effective outcome.
Are you having similar conversations in Silicon Valley? On my mind as I have a Silicon Valley uniform, I feel like today. This is about as California as I'll go, that I didn't wear a tie. But obviously, when you talk about companies and the need to bake some of these standards into the technology that's being built, You're having those conversations with South Korea. What does that conversation look like with startups in Silicon Valley?
Great question in 3 ways. One is, you may recall last year in August, just about a year ago, the president hosted a whole set of private sector entities. And out of that came a lot of deliverables regarding companies' commitments to invest in improving security, to invest in people, growing the number of individuals who have cyber skill sets. It's just a great field. So there have been 3 lines of work there. One, as I mentioned, engaging tech companies to say, bake security in by design. That's where you'll be most impactful. And I mentioned as well the open source initiative that brought that set of companies together with the Open Source Foundation to really focus on improving tech and improving, when you're writing code, improving the products that are used to write code so that it's easier to bake cybersecurity in that way, and to see what are the components in code so that if a vulnerability is found, it's easier to find and fix more quickly.
Mm-hmm.
The second discussion with Silicon Valley is about new areas, emerging tech, like digital assets is a great example. We spent a couple of days in Silicon Valley 3 months ago to engage with different players, both from the digital assets perspective, from the artificial intelligence perspective, to get a good sense of what was happening and to, as we seek to have that balance of promoting innovation in those areas so that the US remains a global leader, but also managing for the risks. So I'll focus on digital assets for a moment. You saw the president issued an executive order a number of months ago that outlined a lot of work on digital assets. Mm-hmm. Work to determine if the US should issue a central bank digital currency, much as China has already done. Work to think about how we protect consumers in the digital asset space, how we bake in cybersecurity into those components. For example, should we consider that cryptocurrencies listing on an exchange can only list if they've met certain security transaction requirements so that we can pursue illicit transactions that occur. And in all of those, we're balancing those 2 core considerations. America is a global innovator. We want to compete. Clearly, we have concerns if countries like China use their central bank digital currency to bypass sanctions, to build global leadership in this digital area. Clearly, we see the benefits potentially of making it cheaper for laborers in one country to send funds home to support their families. But we also, as the significant drop in crypto has shown us, see the risks. Mm-hmm. So in all those efforts, we do extensive consultation with Silicon Valley to hear about the innovation side, to really understand the tech as we work to try to build effective policy, given it's such an emerging area. Same thing on the quantum side.
Is there I hate to simplify it, but is there a standard message? Is there a unified message that you're getting from Silicon Valley on what they want you to do to make it easier for them in terms of protecting networks, but also make it commercially viable?
That's a great question, because only if things are commercially viable are they maintainable over a period of time.
Yeah.
So the first piece we hear consistently is that the safety and security of critical infrastructure in the country matters. Folks need confidence in the energy grid. Folks need confidence in communication systems, and that there's an appreciation for that and for the work the administration is working to do to improve the security of critical infrastructure. The second piece is that I think there's a deeper understanding that tech brings wonderful things. Tech also brings risk, and the role the tech sector has in baking in security. And then finally, as we're thinking about innovative areas, I mentioned quantum, I mentioned digital assets, certainly AI, that the private sector has a real voice and that we will only build effective policy if we consult actively and hear that as we work to design that balance of promote innovation, drive that. That's what makes us who we are, but also we need to manage the risks.
Has your office issued any guidance or weighed in on what you think the priority should be in terms of the infrastructure bill spend on cybersecurity? Just for background, President Biden signed this extraordinary infrastructure bill that crosses so many key areas, roads, bridges, transmission, energy, and cybersecurity. Have you weighed in on that? Forgive my ignorance that I don't know what that picture looks like of your office, the National Cyber Director, CISA. How are priorities being designated right now for cybersecurity via bill?
It's a really fantastic question. And a shout out to Mitch Landru and his team for the work they're doing on implementing the bill. They really brought our team in from the beginning because we recognized that this is a moment in time. It's a wonderful moment in time where the scale of investment that's been done in the IIJL allows us to really improve the security of infrastructure. And we're looking at it in two ways. And I think Mitch's expression, which I love, so give him credit for it, is smart and secure. So what does smart mean? You know, there was a bridge that collapsed a number of months ago in Pennsylvania.
The Pittsburgh Bridge.
The Pittsburgh Bridge, exactly. And I have that picture on actually a poster board in my office because that's where smart can make a difference. E.g., if as we're building bridges, we deploy sensors that track weight, that track wear and tear on a bridge, and that can alert to operators so that people can investigate quickly and prevent that kind of bridge collapse, saving lives, saving money, giving us confidence in the smart security of our infrastructure is key. So as we're building, whether it's a bridge, whether it's adapting the energy grid to ensure that we're tracking energy use and working to stabilize that, there's such opportunity to leverage sensors and technology to achieve those outcomes in less costly ways, because that ensures that the people going to investigate are going where there's problems. So the triaging of the problem is something tech can do for us. So that's on the smart side. And then on the secure side, paying for adding security to existing areas. So for example, the president also rolled out a broadband initiative. And while we want to get Americans safe online, we want to get them there safely. So there are various initiatives we're working on as well to ensure that happens. So that bottom line, the IIJL is just a huge opportunity as we do these infrastructure build-outs in the country to bake in tech, to make them smarter and more secure. And we're running the processes internally. So at the White House, as you noted, we have the National Cyber Director, CISA, the Department of Energy, TSA, Department of Transportation, in partnership with our resilience teammates on the National Security Council at the table. So we're building that in to the projects as they occur.
Again, the multi-agency jurisdictional aspect of this is just mind-blowing. So who then gets to, at the federal level, determine the priorities of the spend? And I presume the states are going to have a key role in this as well. I know at least in the hard infrastructure context, the money's going to go from the Department of Transportation, DOE, to the states, and the states are going to have a role in allocating it. What does that look like on the cyber side?
On the cyber side, they're integrated, right? So as projects come in, we've given the guidance to say include cyber in those projects. So as we rate the different projects, the cyber aspect of those is baked in. There are independent cyber grants that, as you noted, CISA receives from states and local. And on those, we're focused really on the 5 key initiatives that were in the federal program. So in the federal program, we rolled out requirements that agencies do 5 specific things. Roll out multi-factor authentication, roll out essentially alarm systems, endpoint detection, log data because it makes it easier and faster to find what's been taken if an incident occurs, encrypt data, so if it's stolen, it can't be used to blackmail and there's less risk. Those were the key initiatives we rolled out for federal governments. Those are the priorities we've conveyed to CISA for the state and local grants as well, to say, let's start with that. If you encrypt your data, if you have your alarm system in, if you have a security operations center, you'll be much more effective, and that's the minimum standard before you do more.
Got it. I'm also hearing it is a complex process to...
That's a good takeaway.
Let me shift gears, Anne, for one moment. We have a question from Stephen. How can you scale defense? Most of the things that we've talked about are reactive. How do you get ahead of a potential threat?
It's a great question. I think I would lift up two of the things we highlighted that I think are the ways to get ahead of it. One is the tighter integration across the US government, so the intelligence community flags threats in advance for the resilience community, FBI and CISA, so that we understand what might be coming down the pike in terms of adversary capabilities and can convey that early on. But the second aspect of that is really the work with the private sector, both to bake security into products, to make it harder to compromise products, as well as to levy minimum standards so that, for example, we know passwords are dead. We're pressing to say, roll out multi-factor authentication, which is a second factor. It makes it far harder for adversaries to compromise a system. And you know, I come from the offensive side of the house as well. And that was the feedback I heard when I would say, what makes it harder for you to execute offensive operations? Those are the messages we're putting in on the defensive side. So I think those two aspects are proactive, both the alerting the intelligence community to keep in mind evolution of threats, and then second, baking in security into products and specific initiatives we've called for that we know make it harder for actors to conduct their operations. And we know we'll never fully prevent cyber attacks, but we want to make them, as I said, riskier, costlier, and harder. So if an adversary continuously has to build new techniques and can't just reuse the same ones, we've
then you've done your
that.
job. Let me ask you on the offensive piece, recognizing there's probably very little that you're able to say publicly on it, but a constant refrain that I heard on the Hill, which is intuitive, it's compelling, is, damn it, if the Russians are going to go after our critical infrastructure, or if the Chinese are going to hack our core industries, then let's just do it right back to them and show them the cost for what they're doing. What does that look like in reality? One, from a policy perspective, how do you weigh the cost benefit there of deploying offensive tools? And then practically, how capable are we of actually doing back to, say, the Chinese or the Russians what we fear they're doing to us?
Our goal is deterring disruptive or destructive attacks against critical infrastructure. We want adversaries to know they will gain little by disrupting power or water systems in the United States. A part of that deterrence are all the defensive efforts we talked about. Make it much harder. A part of that is making clear, as the President has done, that any disruptive attack against critical infrastructure will be met with a response and being prepared to execute that response.
Good. I think that's about as much as you're able to
Full stop.
Full stop. I believe we have 5 minutes left. Let me ask you a personal question, just thinking about your former offensive world. Transition from NSA to the White House. I presume a very different culture, far broader mission that you have now. You're 15 months in. What are some of the most unexpected lessons learned, experiences that you've had that you just wouldn't have imagined when you left the NSA?
I think, firstly, the coolest part of working at the National Security Council is seeing all the different components of the massive US government, each with their own authorities and capabilities and ability to contribute to a problem, and having that opportunity to connect those for broader impact. And that's the unique role that the White House plays. And the President and my boss, Jake Sullivan's focus on the role of cyber and tech and looking at them for the impact they play on foreign policy has made it particularly fulfilling, because when you have that kind of strategic goal setting
and can convey that to each agency and say, here's what we're trying to do. Let's build unity of effort. Let's focus on outcomes. Let's leave our domestic infrastructure more secure than we found it. Let's build a set of international alliances to make cyberspace more secure than we found it. And everybody recognizes the role of American leadership. So particularly on that international stage, it's been cool to see that whenever we invite others to come and join with us, there's a absolutely thank you, we're in. So, when we launched the counter-ransomware initiative, there was this wellspring of excitement by countries saying it's costing our small and medium-sized businesses money. We're worrying about where these ransoms are going. It's having a disruptive impact, and I think what we saw in Costa Rica highlights that. Thank you for giving us a role. Thank you for leading on that. Has really been fulfilling. And then I would say, coming out of an agency, one always remembers that agencies have many, many priorities and a lot of busy people. So ensuring that at the NSC level, we're crystal clear on priorities, that we partner across the NSC, so we're speaking with one voice, coming out of an agency and knowing how it feels as things come with the force of gravity down to the agency to execute is always something one tries to keep in mind.
So then what does your next 6 months look like? What's going to be tops on your list?
That's so funny you say that, because we just had a strategic planning session this morning on my team. And I really, it's continuing the relentless focus on securing critical infrastructure, including, as you noted, working with the Hill to try to put in place those minimum requirements. It's making real progress on that international alliance to secure cyberspace, and that will be baked in the TTC and the Quad and the counter-ransomware initiative, and in all the bilateral work we're doing with particular countries who may have been compromised, and we want to say, we're here to help. We need you to be more secure so that we can deepen our partnership. Ensuring we have the capabilities in place to respond, as you noted. And then really in the emerging tech space, the microelectronics space is so interesting in this way. Quantum, digital assets, space, AI, that we're focused on real outcomes to move both the innovation and security in tandem forward. And there are a number of key initiatives you'll see us announcing, almost all in partnership with allies, where the US government will both seek to lead and seek to partner.
It's refreshing to hear, because Anne, it sounds like you are leading a pretty novel building partnership capacity effort. CNAS, in fact, probably more than a decade ago, under the leadership of Vikram Singh, who I worked with at the Pentagon, was pretty forward-leaning in coming up with various programs for building the military capacity of partners to combat terror, to conduct operations that the U.S. would want to happen, but that we wouldn't want to pay for, or that where we couldn't put people on the ground. That resulted in what has now become called the 333 Authority in the NDAA. It's a robust authority in the Pentagon. It sounds like you are building the cyber equivalent of that, of being able to go to partner nations and say, we will help you build your cyber capabilities so that, one, we can work together, and two, that you can be closing those doors and protecting networks so that we don't have to. Is that a fair analogy?
We're all more secure if we're secure together to that point. The same techniques are used, so if another country is more capable in having visibility, finding them quickly, and alerting, we're all more secure. And on the emerging tech side, that's a great reference, right? Vikram has really been highlighting from an India perspective. They're doing major spectrum 5G auctions. Let's use that to show that there are trusted telecom opportunities, and that can be done at scale, and that countries like India can use their native software base to ensure that those technologies are built securely. So that's beautifully put, and I think that's a great sum up of our conversation, that A, we're all in it together, B, we're so much more effective when we have unity of effort in building security, and for today's tech and for tomorrow's tech as well.
Thank you. And if I had a mantra as well, or a closing comment, it would be that idea of we are in it all together. that's partner nations, that's US companies, and it's Congress. So Godspeed in making effort on all of those fronts. Thank you for being here, and thank you for your service and for all of your efforts. As a citizen, I'm so happy to see that you're in government doing what you're doing. So thank you.
I have an amazing team, and there's an amazing team across the US government and the private sector who's working together. So I think that inspires all of us every day. Thank you.
Thank you.